Russia has waged war on Ukraine for over 42 months, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we have to start in the central Ukrainian region of Dnipropetrovsk. Here, the Russian army has taken control of a fourth village. We have footage from Zaporizhzhye, a very small village located about 5 kilometers behind the regional border between Donetsk on one side and Dnipropetrovsk on the other. Once more, we see the Russians. They're trying to demonstrate moving in and out. Yes, they've taken control of this village, raised their flag, and we're witnessing it firsthand. It's a relatively small village. I think there are maybe 2 streets that cross each other at an intersection. However, the Russians don't seem to be getting stopped here, unlike in other areas. We recall that near Pokrovsk, the situation is going relatively well for the Ukrainian military forces. Here we still have the situation where this very, very small village was at least captured, and the Russians are slowly but steadily advancing westward. Let's take a look at the map right away. We're going to see exactly which region we're dealing with here, and it's still the southeast of Ukraine. But what's particularly striking here is Zaporizhzhye, a village that, according to our deep state map's latest updates, hasn't yet been taken under Russian control, which, however, has now quite clearly, as we can see from the material, fallen in this area. We have seen once again there are only 2 soldiers, only 2 Russian soldiers. That means it's entirely possible for the Ukrainian forces to successfully launch a counterattack from the Bereshova region. And they've already done that in some villages here and around Welika Novosilka and Koma in recent days. However, it could also be that the Russians, as we've at least seen here, are slowly but surely pushing further west, like I said. But the Ukrainian army has also recaptured a village. We're looking at footage from Novomikhailivka. Novomikhailivka, another very small village with only about 10 houses situated in the far north of the Donetsk region. Here, it was the 3rd Assault Brigade that ultimately succeeded in retaking the village after it had been under Russian control for roughly 3 weeks. And we see a very similar tactic. Here too, they are buzzing in and out. Now we see the Ukrainian flag instead, of course, to prove, yes, we made it. Now we also see some of the materials as well as several of the key strategic processes that were specifically employed to reclaim the village. We see that it was primarily drones, kamikaze drones, that were used in the operation. Additionally, of course, ground troops were also deployed to carry out operations here. The goal was to advance and retake Novomikhailivka. As mentioned, a small success, a respect-gaining achievement for the Ukrainian army, which at least shows we are also active in the north of Donetsk, very close to the Kharkiv region, by the way. Here as well, we're not just on the defensive, but we are also capable of retaking at least small settlements. We want to take a closer look at the map and see, as mentioned, we are situated much further north, near Lyman in the broadest sense. Lyman, a contested city, is located here. Nearby, Kreminna, under Russian control, isn't marked on this map. And in between, we've been reporting on the fighting around Sarechne and Torske, these 2 small villages in the middle. And as mentioned, Novomikhailivka is located further north. What you can't see now, just a few meters away, is about 2,000 meters south of Kharkiv's border. That's why we also have Kupiansk up here, a city in Kharkiv that's currently under contest. So we see the Ukrainians aren't just trying to putting up resistance in key strategic areas, not just around Pokrovsk, but also in the northern parts of the Donetsk region, gradually yet steadily pushing the Russians back. And speaking of Pokrovsk, we might as well move right into the region. A neighboring town of Pokrovsk, Kostyantinivka, formerly with over 70,000 or nearly 70,000 inhabitants, is contested, and the Russians have been claiming for several days now that they had taken the suburb of Katarinivka. Back then, we had seen a relatively large mechanized attack on Katarinivka. We had seen that at least 5 armored personnel carriers had arrived in the center of the village and were partly destroyed there, but the Russians have since been saying, yes, we've gained a foothold here, and that wouldn't actually be entirely unusual, even if the units, the mobile units, the armored personnel carriers are destroyed, but the Russians still reach the target and manage to establish a foothold there. Katarinivka, though, remains clearly under Ukrainian control on this particular map here. And in this case, the deep state map is accurate, as a recent video from the Russian army clearly demonstrates, showing that the attacks targeted Katarinivka. Quite interesting, the Russians claim here that they specifically targeted this building, which we see here in the middle, just rewound briefly, the structure we see here in the center with Mr. S attacked, a 152mm self-propelled gun. Yet what we see here is rocket propulsion. That suggests it most likely resembles an anti-tank rocket that was utilized in this specific situation. What we're seeing here is that we're definitely in the center of Katarinivka where this explosion occurred. And this once again shows that the Russians are spreading propaganda that the Russian army and also the bloggers have been claiming for 3 weeks now since this assault on Katarinivka. The village was under their control, but now we see it's being attacked from a distance. And Katarinivka here, as mentioned, another crucial suburb of Kostyantinivka. is relatively clearly under Ukrainian control, because the Russians can only monitor it from the air and attack it with anti-tank missiles, which have a range of approximately 2 to 4 kilometers depending on the type. And why the Russians are making such slow progress, that's mainly due to the drones deployed by the Ukrainian side. We want to take a look at 2 recent videos that clearly demonstrate just how incredibly lethal the drones being used have become. Here is truly, as I believe, dramatic footage that once again shows how pointlessly Putin sacrifices his population in the war against Ukraine. We see here a Russian soldier who is just in the process of covering his dead comrade here. That means he actually took the time to quickly sling the rifle over his back and carefully cover his fallen comrade right here. Why is that? Right next to us we can clearly spot another impact crater here where most likely a Ukrainian grenade had just landed a few moments earlier on. Possibly from a drone, as we'll see in a moment, or artillery or a mortar. And now we see from above. As soon as he placed it there, he continues alone toward the next position. So if you will, the Ukrainian pilots are now taking care of him and actively making efforts to stop him in his tracks here. We can see the whole thing quite well from this position. What we just saw was the crater here, this large crater, which is still relatively bright, illuminated. Next to it, the one it covered is most likely, as I mentioned before, a fallen comrade. We can see that by the dark area, so it's relatively dark, and we can still see that there's quite a bit of light peeking through. And that's him who now, so to speak, is looking to move forward, aiming in this specific direction here, but is immediately attacked by the Ukrainian army. And then comes the next explosion. A very, very severe explosion here, claims him. We see this from different perspectives, once from the dropping drone itself and from the surveillance drone. Here we can see it clearly, the earlier situation again. These are now both craters that we see here with the fallen comrade, and here's the one we now have to pixelate, of course, who walked just a few meters further and then no more than 10 meters away from his comrade also dies, because he is also killed here by the Ukrainian army now with drones that drop grenades directly on him. Another video we want to take a look at shows just how incredibly dangerous the Russian advance has become, because the Ukrainians have adapted and are now using fiber optic drones just like the Russian army. We see here a Russian soldier moving through one of these forest bridges, which at least so far has always been relatively safe. The Ukrainians could only shoot up with artillery or something similar and then hope to hit something. Now the situation has completely changed. We see that the Russians are moving through the forest, and we see that the surveillance drone is not only filming them, but also, as we can see from another perspective, a fiber optic guided kamikaze drone, which is essentially following him. There's the Russian soldier we just saw, and the drone is tracking him closely as it follows through the forest. We'll see this from another perspective shortly. Here's the Russian soldier, and right behind him, I'll pause it briefly, you can clearly see the drone following just a few meters away. Now again, the perspective of the drone pilot, the fiber optic guided kamikaze drone. And we see the whole thing ends tragically, or rather fatally, for the Russian soldier who is then killed here. That means we see these innovations which in this case Russia has introduced and which Ukraine has now adapted and utilized. These innovations lead to the fact that it is for the Russian soldiers who want to advance, it becomes increasingly difficult. We've known that for the past few months. Yes, essentially armored personnel carriers and tanks, which we still saw in large numbers in action a year ago, are no longer being used at the front, except on certain days, maybe 2 or 3 days a month, when you can still see that because the area is so heavily contaminated with mines that the Russians can't advance further. We're now seeing that fiber optic technology has allowed even infantry soldiers to be targeted by effectively operating in forests or similar terrains. Buildings, rubble, or even basements are no longer safe from these drones, making the situation increasingly challenging for the Russian military. Yet not only drones are being used, but of course classic weapons remain important, such as the Ukrainian Air Force. We've just obtained a new video showing an extremely heavy attack on the headquarters of the Russian army in Soledar, which occurred a few days ago but has only been made public now. So we've already heard from the Russians that during an attack on Soledar, 5 high-ranking officers were killed. Perhaps we can stop that in time, though it's quite difficult. And we can see that here, one of these residential buildings from the former 10,000 inhabitant town of Soledar, which was completely depopulated by the Russians, is being hit by what is likely an AASM-250 or even larger bomb, which is hitting precisely this former residential building where the Russian army is currently stationed. As mentioned, we only had the information so far that I believe on August 17th, 5 Russian officers were killed here in Soledar. Now we see why that happened, because, well, the Ukrainians, through their reconnaissance, found out exactly where the Russians were located. And we can see it here now. What's that? Roughly a 4 or 5 story building was completely destroyed, at least on one side where they were certain the Russians were stationed inside. Why is it possible? Because the Ukrainians are able to use their air force even directly at the front, currently I believe almost about 20 kilometers behind the front line, and still maintain operational control. They are still able, through this catapult motion from their aircraft, to effectively launch these to deploy glide bombs, though without their own propulsion, so guided glide bombs, and to very precisely attack the Russians far behind the front lines with them. But not only the Ukrainians continue to rely on air attacks, but of course Russia as well. We have new footage from the south of Ukraine, specifically the Kherson region, which clearly demonstrates how Russia is active many kilometers behind the city of Kherson, which remains firmly under Ukrainian control. Here some of their bombs are being deployed, and we're about to see it. These are very precise hits on this house here, where the Russians, where they at least presumably suspect the Ukrainian army is inside, and as stated in the communique, claim that it's the Ukrainian army they're targeting here. And now we're seeing here 1, 2, 3, at least 2 or 3 impacts all hitting the same building. That means very, now the fourth one right next to it too, very precise strikes, most likely again with FAB 500 bombs, which were probably dropped from a Su-34 about 50 kilometers further south, then flew over the front, passed over the Intenebre, and continued over Kherson city. And about 10 kilometers further north, they eventually reached and hit this particular village here. As I mentioned, we can't fully clarify it if civilians were inside at the end. However, in this specific instance, the Russians did hit precisely what the reconnaissance drone captured on film and what they had intended to strike. Therefore, presumably at least a hit that also inflicted significant damage on the Ukrainian army. But it's not just the Russian Air Force that's active in the Kherson region, the Ukrainian army is also active. We have another video, this time from south of Dnieper, directly on the opposite side in the close vicinity of Oleshki. And here we observe how the Ukrainians successfully destroyed a Russian artillery piece concealed in a forest, employing precise counter-battery fire, also referred to as counter-artillery. It's not entirely clear what was used here. My guess is artillery from the Ukrainian side as well. Massive secondary explosions now, right after that initial hit. After the forest was struck, leading to an initial explosion and fire, we're now seeing these massive blasts happening here. The Ukrainians assert it was a 152mm artillery piece belonging to the Russian army with a range of roughly 20, extending up to 30 kilometers depending on the ammunition. That was the target of this attack. And so we see that both sides are still exchanging fire in the Kherson region in the south of the country, and even here, far behind the front lines, it remains relatively dangerous. It is also for the armed units, both the invaders and the defenders. Let's take a quick look at the map and see the footage we just had, as mentioned earlier, from the southern part of the country, right here where Kherson is located. The one thing we observed from the Ukrainian side was that the attack took place roughly here near Sahi, which is a very small village situated between Oleshki and Radensk in that specific part of the region. Nearby, as mentioned, is a relatively large forest area where the attack took place. And the other attack was reportedly positioned here, close to the highway between Kherson and Mykolaiv. That means both sides are, as we see once more, able to deliver strikes approximately 10 to 20 kilometers behind the front lines, whether it's through the use of glide bombs on one side or precision-guided artillery on the other. Finally, we want to turn to Russia, where we'll take another look at the ongoing fuel crisis, which continues to intensify. We have new footage from Vladivostok, a major city in the eastern part of the country, and we now see an eyewitness strolling through a completely empty gas station, devoid of people and cars, taking a look at. There's simply nothing left here now. We can see the octane ratings. In Russia, there's still this 92 octane fuel, which is less efficient but cheaper to produce. Nonetheless, a lot of Russian vehicles still run on that and also on 95 octane, which is what we know as regular super. And now none of it is available anymore. We just saw the fuel pump, and now we're seeing how this guy is moving on. And then it's either under repair at this gas station, or there's a sign saying, like, I believe 95 octane, sorry, it's no longer available, probably due to supply issues or maintenance. So something like that is written here. Exactly, here we see it. And so it's relatively clear for this Russian here that due to the attacks, particularly the refinery strikes in the west and the center of the country, the fuel supply here in the east is now running critically and dangerously low. In the Far East, it has become quite problematic. At some gas stations, though not all, it's completely unavailable. And that it stays that way, Ukraine tries to ensure every day with new attacks on new refineries. We have another video from yesterday morning where we see, for a change I must say, that one of these attacks didn't work. We see here specifically the refinery in Sisran, about 870 kilometers away from the current front, and we see a Ukrainian drone moving towards it, once again attempting to hit this refinery. On August 15th, the refinery was struck and burned intensely for several consecutive days. This time, it seems like the Russians have luck in their misfortune here, as the drone misses its target by a few meters and ends up exploding in the forest instead. We can see it down here, the explosion not quite at the refinery. There could be various reasons for that, of course. Either there's successful electronic warfare here for a change, as I mentioned earlier. Here we see it again. Here we see the drone once more, and here we can see it flying into the forest from this spot. Either successful electronic warfare and they diverted the drone, essentially feeding it false data, which caused it to lose orientation and crash. And of course, this is also possible, the Ukrainians experienced a malfunction here. Of course, if you're deploying between 20 and 50 drones every single night, firing them into Russia, it's entirely possible that some of them fail to reach their target simply because technical malfunctions prevent them from doing so effectively. Nevertheless, we see once again that Syzran is at the center of the country, which came under attack. Let's take a look at that on the map as well. We had the very successful Ukrainian attack on Ost-Luga recently on this Baltic seaport here. We don't see that right now, but it's located near St. Petersburg. And back here, well to the east of Moscow, we have Syzran, which was also attacked, happening at the same time. However, as said, only one fire and explosion occurred in Ust-Luga. The refinery in Syzran got lucky, and as such, it's now Ukraine's responsibility to assess the situation and evaluate the extent of the damage. And if it comes to it, as we've seen time and time again in the past, to strike again with more kamikaze drones here.